So this video is highly requested. I'm going to be putting the brand new A7C-R against my A7 IV. Now, all you guys know, I love the A7 IV. I've made a whole bunch of videos on that camera. It's amazing for photos. It's amazing for videos. It does pretty much everything. It is the hybrid camera, the jack of all trades, but we have that new kid on the block. The A7C-R is pretty much a smaller A7R5, and it pretty much has every single specs in that and slightly more, but obviously takes out a few others as well. But we're comparing these two cameras and which one is going to be best in your situation. So you have to remember that it's the right tool for the right job, because some specs may suit you, some specs don't really matter to you, but you do have to take everything into consideration of what your use case is going to be. So we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of the body and the features, externally, internally, the image quality when it comes to video and photo, and my overall thoughts on both of the cameras, who they're for. Timestamps will be below, so let's get into the video. First of all, we must discuss the price. The A7C-R comes in at about $2,998 US, whereas the A7 IV currently is $2,298 US. So there is a $700 US difference, so take that into consideration when comparing these two. So the A7C-R has that awesome full frame 61 megapixel sensor that's out of the A7R5. Now that sensor is incredible for photography and obviously videography as well, whereas the A7 IV has that brand new 33 megapixel sensor that you do see in the new A7C Mark II as well. Now when it comes to the body, the A7C-R has a 2.36 million dot EVF, whereas the A7 IV has the 3.69 million dot EVF. Now, does that matter to you? It really depends. When it comes to the EVF, as long as you can see it and it's high enough resolution, it's perfectly fine, and I don't mind the 2.36 million dot. It's perfectly fine in my opinion. But I know a lot of photographers don't like that EVF and they prefer that really high 9.44 million dot EVF that's in the A7R5. Now they both have that fully articulating screen that you pretty much see on every other brand new Sony camera that's out, except for the A7R5 has that 4D articulating screen. It's incredible. It does amazing things, but the A7C-R did not inherit that one. Now when it comes to the dials, they're pretty much the same. You got two at the back, one at the front. You also have that hybrid switch that can go from photo, video to SNQ, and then obviously the dial at the top, which can give you 1, 2, 3 custom buttons. There's a whole bunch of customability when it comes to all these dials, which is great. But the A7 IV has 4 custom buttons, whereas the A7C-R only has 2 custom buttons. Now, I know a lot of people love custom buttons. Me, myself, I love having specific buttons for obviously specific scenarios, like APS-C crop mode is literally a button for me. Clear image zoom is literally a button. Focus mapping is a button. Really depends. You can customize it to however you want, and I prefer to have more options rather than not enough. Now this next one kind of sucks for some people, and that is the joystick. The A7 IV has a joystick, whereas the A7C-R does not. Now I know a lot of photographers don't like that, and it really comes down to personal preference, but at the end of the day, I prefer to have a joystick as well, rather than not have one. Now in terms of the other physical differences, the A7 IV's grip is thicker than the A7C-R, but when it comes to the A7C-R, you do have that new finger base mount that you can actually put, and just gives you slightly taller grip. So it does come with the A7C-R, or you can buy it separately as well. Really depends, but I do personally prefer slightly thicker when it comes to that handle. They are slightly too small in the A7C-R in my opinion, but each to their own when it comes to ergonomics. Now the A7C-R has one SD card slot. This is where the A7 IV completely demolishes it. It's got 2 SD card slots, and also one of them is a Type A card slot. Now that is incredible when it comes to buffering speeds, because Type A cards are much faster than SD cards. But you're still able to access all the features and functions obviously in the A7C-R with a V90 card. But I have been running into some buffering issues with the A7C-R because it is just an SD card. Yes, I'm using a fast V90 card, but if I do have it on high frame rate, it's got 61 megapixels to write to that card. And if you're doing 8 frames per second, it does fill up quite fast and you start to lag and that buffering kicks in. Not great. But the A7C-R was not designed for those high frame rates. Also, when talking about the shutter speed, the A7C-R has a maximum shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second in mechanical and 1/8000th of a second in electronic, whereas the A7 IV has a mechanical shutter of up to 1/8000th of a second, which is a pretty big deal when it comes to using fast lenses in high key situations. Now, if we go over to the other side of the A7 IV body and pretty much the same side as the A7CR, we've got the USB-C connection. Now, the USB-C connection is the newest 3.2 gen, which is amazing, and it's pretty much you plug it directly into the camera and you almost won't lose any battery if you're streaming, but it also gives you that 4K 30 when it comes to streaming as well, whereas the A7 IV only does 1080p when it comes to connecting it to your computer. Now, the biggest win here is that HDMI. The A7 IV has a full-size HDMI, whereas the A7CR only has a micro HDMI. I absolutely hate that. I really dislike that. I think it's the worst thing you could ever have in a camera, but it is what it is. It's still workable. You can still do that 16-bit RAW through an Atomos Ninja 5 if you really wanted to through that micro HDMI, but a full-size HDMI is just so much thicker, it's so much more reliable, and pretty much if you're going to be buying a hybrid camera, you want to be able to put a monitor on top and connect a full-size HDMI into it. I mean, me personally, I prefer HDMI or SDI. Now, they also both do have that headphone and microphone jack as well. Okay, now let's talk about the internal video specs. The A7CR does 4K up to 60 frames per second with a 1.2 times crop. And if you do want 120 frames per second, you do have to drop it down to 1080p. Whereas the A7 IV does 4K at 60 frames per second with a 1.5 times crop. And it also does that 1080p at 120 frames per second. But there is one major caveat in the A7CR, is that because it is an 8K sensor, and if you do put into Super 35 crop mode, you can actually get a 6.2K downsampled 4K image, which actually looks pretty good. But in saying that as well, the A7 IV is a 7K sensor that downsamples to 4K, so it should look pretty similar, but you are shooting in full frame mode rather than Super 35 crop mode. So the depth of field would actually look a little bit different. And also, even the 1080p in the A7CR does look like it has slightly higher resolution than the A7 IV's 1080p as well. And I know a lot of people still utilize 1080p, so that could be a pretty big difference between the two cameras. But if you are putting it into the real world, that 6.2K downsampled to 4K against the A7 IV's full frame, you can't really notice too much of a difference. Like literally this side by side, I made sure all the settings were completely the same, and the focal length I actually matched as well, so you could pretty much see the exact same framing, and it's really hard to tell the difference, to be honest. Obviously, you're going to notice that the A7 IV will have slightly better depth of field than the A7CR because it's a Super 35 versus full frame. But when it comes to the image quality, you almost couldn't notice any difference realistically. Now, we've got to talk about that one thing that is related to image quality, and that comes down to rolling shutter. Now, the A7CR's rolling shutter is better in the full frame mode compared to the A7 IV because the A7 IV is 7K downsampled to 4K, which you could imagine the processor is finding it a hard time, and you will get that jello effect. But if you do compare the Super 35 crop mode to the A7 IV's full frame, you will actually notice that the A7CR has way more rolling shutter because it is a 6.2K sensor that downsamples to the 4K. Now, when it comes to rolling shutter in 4K 50 or 4K 60, it is slightly better in the A7 IV, even though the A7CR is a 1.2 times crop and it is pixel binned. It's just a slightly slower readout sensor. You do have a little bit more rolling shutter. It's not crazily different or noticeable between the two. And if you go into 1080p, it's almost the same. The A7CR does look a little bit sharper, so it might actually be slightly worse rolling shutter, but it's much of a muchness there. Now, they obviously do both film in 10-bit 422 when it comes to pretty much all the codecs, except for 1080p at 120 frames per second. In that mode, you do have to switch it over to S&Q mode, and that will give you the ability to have the 10-bit 422, but it's only 50 megabits per second, so the bitrate is a little bit less than what you normally would get. Now, if we compare the dynamic range between the A7CR in the Super 35 crop mode and the A7 IV in full frame, it is very, very similar. The A7CR actually has about 12.2 stops of dynamic range, whereas the A7 IV has about 12.9 stops of dynamic range. Okay, let's talk about IBIS. We've got 5.5 stops in the older A7 IV, and you've got 7 stops when it comes to the new A7CR. Now, is there a massive difference between the two? On paper, sure, there is a difference, but when it comes to the real world, Not a crazy difference. You can notice the difference and the better IBIS in the A7CR compared to the A7 IV, but it is much of a muchness at the end of the day. It really comes down to the individual, and if you are really good at hand holding, if you're really good at ninja walking, or if you're not good at either of those, then you would just go a gimbal. But if you are putting it into IBIS plus active stability, it is pretty much of a muchness. Like, it really does make this even playing ground between the two. So now when it comes to photos, you do have that 61 megapixel sensor, which generally is a little bit better than the 33 megapixel sensor because you almost have twice the amount of resolution. So having that twice the amount of resolution will give you more ability to crop in post-production. So if you are a landscape photographer, architecture photographer, portrait photographer, wildlife, you do have that ability to crop in more and fix and, reorientate your photos much more in the A7CR than you do in the A7 IV. But the A7 IV has the ability to do 10 frames per second, whereas the A7CR has the ability to do 8 frames per second. But like I said, when it comes to high burst mode, I am running into buffering issues in the A7CR, whereas the A7 IV, I don't run into any buffering issues because I am using a Type A card. But when you actually do uncompressed RAW in the A7 IV, you only get about 6 frames per second. But if you do compressed RAW, that's where you get about 10 frames per second. And I did actually make a video comparing uncompressed versus compressed if you do want to watch that when it comes to photography. So now when it comes to the menu systems, they're pretty much identical. You do have the A7CR that has slightly more features because of the AI processor. So you do have slightly better autofocusing systems, which allows you to do, a whole bunch of planes, trains, cars, all those kind of things inside that, as opposed to the A7 IV. But you've also got the AI framing in the A7CR, which is pretty incredible. I've done a whole bunch of testings in other videos. You can go check that one out. But it also has that slightly new menu system at the top. You've got menu 1 and menu 2, which gives you a whole bunch of quick features that you can sort of quickly go into, which the A7 IV doesn't have that. But when it comes to the newest features like focus breathing compensation, variable shutter mode, also focus mapping, they both have identical features there. There's a couple of things that is a little bit different in the A7CR, and that comes to internal video time-lapse you can do in the A7CR, but also pixel shift mode when it comes to photography. So you can pretty much stitch 4 or 16 photos together and give you a much higher resolution image overall. But you have to do that in the Image Edge app in post-production. And like all the other new Sony cameras, you can load in your own monitoring LUTs in the A7CR as well, whereas the A7 IV, you can't do that. So overall, what are my thoughts? I mean, I love the sensor of the A7CR. It's incredible, 61 megapixels. It does a lot, but I do feel like it is way too crippled for my liking in comparison to the A7R5. I do feel like if you are spending that kind of money, you should go that little bit extra further and just get the A7R5 because that camera is incredible. I still would choose the A7 IV all day. The 2 card slots, the extra custom buttons, you've got the full-size HDMI. That's a pretty big deal for me. And when it comes to my workflow, having a smaller body doesn't really worry me whatsoever. I do have the ZV-E1 if I want a smaller compact body. So in my personal use, the A7 IV is the winner here. In your use, I mean, it could be completely different. You may not worry about the 1 card slot. You may not worry about the full-size HDMI. Those things probably don't suit you. You probably just want a camera to take around street photography, portrait photography, and you don't need a big camera. You just need that sensor, that amazing sensor that's inside. So you really do have to break it down in what features you prefer and what suits your workflow. So anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. That would be amazing. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. The link will be in the description below if you do want to check out my LUTs as well. I do sell some LUTs, so you can check them out. Go onto my website and check that out. Other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.